but we might have a start because it's 5:05. And as you know, this will continue on until the drinks arrive. So basically, we're here for nearly 2 hours, but depending on how long questions and answers are and when the sandwiches turn up, we will go through 4 speakers. And I'd like to begin by welcoming you to the UCL Humanitarian Institute Evening Conference. And I'm told this is a very exciting moment in time because it's had a long COVID pause. So it's lovely to be here in person with you all. My name is Lisa. I work at the IRDR mostly on the Bachelor of Science that we have, which is Global Humanitarian Response. And I will be introducing 4 experts, and it's going to be, I'm personally really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Now, I'd like to preface this panel by saying the title is Humanitarian Shelter and Climate Change. Is the shelter sector ready? And this is not quite a caveat, but it's certainly a discussion that we need to have, in that if we're talking about climate, shelter, the built environment, humanitarian response, there's very few experts that talk to all of those things. So we decided to have a panel because everybody here is an expert in different aspects of this topic. And I'm sure all of you in the audience will be seeing this from very different perspectives. So between the 4 people we have here, I'm sure we can answer all of your questions, but everybody will have a particular point of view and come from a particular practitioner, academic, research, institutional approach. So I think we're going to be in for a lot of very different discussions, which I think will be super interesting. So first we have Aditya Bahadur, who is the principal researcher in the Human Settlements Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development, which I've just discovered is right down the road. Magnus Wolfe-Murray, independent humanitarian specialist who mostly works in shelter, is an advisor for the FCDO, currently in Cox's Bazar, so a little bit further afield. Kate Crawford is from the Engineering and Design Institute, which is to.debate London. And Amelia Rule is from the Norwegian Refugee Council. And I'm just going to take literally 2 more minutes and go over a couple of slides. And the first one is on climate. And we're not going to get into graphs and charts and red colours in this panel discussion. And in fact, these are the only slides, you'll probably be very happy to know. But what we're going to focus on is climate impacts. And this is just an extract from the report that I know many of you will be familiar with, the most recent IPCC report from the Working Group 2, which talks about human-induced climate change and how the rise in weather and climate extremes has led to some irreversible impacts as natural and human systems are pushed beyond their ability to adapt. And I think this links very closely with our theme tonight and our question, which is the shelter sector ready? And the next slide I have is simply a summary, bringing together the Climate and Environment Charter and some of the extra things we're going to be talking about around shelter, which, and those discussions can often focus on resilience and sustainability. And we all interpret those words in different ways as well. But the Climate and Environment Charter now has, I think, around 200 institutes and organisations signed up. This is specifically a charter for humanitarian agencies, and you'll be hearing a lot more about it tomorrow if you're going to go to the forum, is my understanding. But we talk a lot about adapting in the shelter sector, but also mitigating. And when we talk about mitigating, I think on the panel tonight we'll not only refer to climate changes, but also perhaps wider environmental considerations. So I just wanted to flag this as a kind of, do I sound too academic if I say conceptual framework? So I am going to hand it over right now to Aditya. We're going to speak for about 10 minutes each. We're going to open for question and answers, and then we're going to come back to the panel. Okay, are there any burning questions? If you need to go out, please just use the rear door. Apart from that, let's get started. Aditya, thank you.
Thank you. Mike is working. Thank you very much, Lisa. My name is Aditya, and I work at the International Institute for Environmental Development. And even though I started my career with the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, I don't consider myself an expert in humanitarian issues or shelter. But I'm on this panel because I do want to talk about climate resilient development, especially in urban contexts, which I think has very important implications for what the other panelists are going to talk about. I think the first thing to recognize is that big shifts are afoot. And I would argue that urban areas are becoming an increasingly important theatre in which humanitarian crises are unfolding. And this is for a couple of reasons. One is, I think it was 2018 when, for the first time in the history of the world, more people started living in town and cities than in non-urban areas. And by 2050, this figure is set to rise to something like 70 or 75%. So the world is urbanizing rapidly. And let's step back and ask ourselves, where are cities located? They're mostly along the coast and almost always along the river. So they are in places that are highly exposed to hydrometeorological disasters or other kinds of shocks and stresses. So cities are important. Now, at the same time, the nature of risk is shifting too. The IPCC reports have told us consistently that extreme events are on the rise. There's a lot of information out there. Hurricane Katrina was a 1 in 400 year event, whereas all the infrastructure in New Orleans was geared for, I think it was a 1 in 80 year event. The number of extremely hot days in the United States is set to go up by 3 times over the next 50 years. The number of extreme rainfall events in India doubled in a 50-year period from the 60s to the early 2000s. So extreme events are on the rise. The second important shift is that transboundary risk is increasing. And this is just a fancy way of saying that a little disturbance in one place leads to disaster in another. And this is due to the hyper-densification of our economic networks, our social networks. Good example of this is a hurricane that hit the car manufacturing parts of Thailand, and which led to factory closures in Brazil, in Yemen, in Pakistan, all over Southeast Asia. So something that happened in Thailand had big economic consequences in other parts of the world. And the third thing that is starting to happen is we're seeing more and more simultaneous crises unfolding. So we see 2 or 3 different kinds of disasters happening at the same time. And in the first year of COVID-19, 55 million people were infected with COVID-19. The same 55 million also faced floods, cyclones, and hurricanes. So this is another new type of evolution and risk that I think the humanitarian and shelter sector has to contend with. So what do we do about it? I would argue there are 5 things, but happy to be challenged. I think the foundation of any kind of response to these shifts has to emanate from a new approach to collecting and analyzing data on risk. Yes, we need to still continue using existing approaches, be it climate models or survey data or participatory approaches, but we need to acknowledge that there are some severe drawbacks. And so, for instance, existing approaches of understanding risk have problems with certainty. A climate model will never tell you that in Houston Station in the year 2052, the temperature is going to be 1.5 degrees above normal. It will tell you roughly in this part of the world, the temperature will go up between 2 degrees and 2.7 degrees. Not very useful for decision making. And then there's a problem of granularity. It's very difficult to predict what's going to happen in small areas. And those are the areas in which decision makers work. So I speak to municipal planners all the time, and they say, show me climate data that I can use for making the next municipal plan. Don't talk to me in 300 square kilometer grids. And I think there are problems of veracity where we have to acknowledge that while participatory approaches have played an extremely useful role in urban context specifically, there are major challenges in applying things like participatory rural appraisals that were developed for rural areas. And therefore, we need to pivot towards embracing new kinds of approaches for producing, analyzing, understanding data. And this could include two things. It can include big data, a crude term that is bandied around sloppily, and I'm going to bandy it around sloppily as well. But data on risk that emanates from people who are on the front line of risk. And this includes people who are suffering humanitarian crises. It includes transient populations. It includes displaced people. Let me give you one small example, and there are lots of examples I can go into in question and answers. In East Africa, a couple of years ago, they wanted to take a different approach to trying to understand who needs food aid. What is the traditional approach? You get a sense that there's a crisis unfolding somewhere. You send in a team, they do an extremely expensive and time-consuming household survey to understand how many calories have been consumed, and that determines the kind of response. Okay, I'm caricaturing it, but that's broadly the process. Now, this new approach, what they did was they figured out that there was a very strong correlation between mobile phone recharge top-ups and the amount of calories that people were consuming in their homes. Very simply put, they figured out that when a household starts to top up their cell phones from below a particular amount, say $5 a month, at that point they are almost certainly not consuming the right amount of calories. So by crowdsourcing this data from cell phone providers, they felt that they had a pretty good idea of the level of food security at the local level, which allows them to respond much more quickly. And in this case, because it was a pilot, they calibrated the findings with actual survey data, and they found there was a high degree of correlation. So the world is changing, and I think people who are trying to reduce risk need to embrace these approaches. And of course, I'm not a big data evangelist. I did my PhD at the Institute of Development Studies, which is the home of participatory development. So I really don't think, I'm not starry-eyed about it. I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I think no longer can we afford to ignore the resonance of these approaches for risk management. The second shift that I think needs to happen is in the way that we work with communities. I think at the moment the field is splattered with a myriad of small interventions working to make people more resilient to different kinds of crises. There is increasing evidence that these are not taking place at scale, these are not sustainable. Don't take my word for it. A university in Australia recently did a retrospective analysis of community-based climate adaptation initiatives that had unfolded in the Pacific region over a 10-year period, and unsurprisingly found that 93% of them stopped to deliver benefits once donor funding was retracted. They're not sustainable, really. And what I also worry about is far too much work with communities takes place only at the community level. Let me explain that. I think for an intervention to be effective at the community level, you have to do things at the city level, you have to do things at the provincial level, you have to make shifts in policy at the national level, but that doesn't happen. People largely work at the local level to manage risk, particularly in cities. And I think we need to shift that. We need to shift from this approach of tinkering around to developing local institutions that are owned by people who are on the front lines of risk and who have a long-term perspective on responding to humanitarian crises and building resilience. And there are examples of it. I'm going to draw an example from the global north, which is the New York Mayor's Office of Risk and Resiliency. Yes, I don't for a minute think that every country in the global south can have such a well-funded large department, but it encapsulates and presents a model that can be replicated. I also feel it's important to work across scales. You need to do things at the community level, but you need to do things at the international level. And the model that Slum Dwellers International adopts to various things, various kinds of development programs with people in informal settlements, is an archetypical example of that. They work at the slum level, but they federate at the city level, they federate at the national level, they federate internationally, and therefore they've been able to have a big impact. They've been able to mobilize something like $20 million over the past couple of decades to upgrade 200,000 homes across a large number of cities. Number three, I'm getting there. Number three is a dramatic shift in planning approaches. What is the current practice to enhance the resilience to different kinds of crises, including humanitarian crises? It's like looking at what are the formal plans that a particular area has and then mainstreaming risk within it. I would contend in urban areas, especially of the global south, some of the cities that are most at risk of different kinds of shocks and stresses are those that have a high degree of informality, sometimes up to 60%, sometimes up to 70%. I clearly remember looking at an extremely elegant, very evolved master plan, of a second-tier city in India. I was on the fourth floor of the City Development Authority, and this had everything. I pressed all the buttons. They considered flood risk. They looked at long-term resilience issues, and I looked out of the window. There was absolutely no correlation between the master plan and what I was seeing in the city, because so much of the city is informal and expands not on the back of municipal planners, but on the back of informal guilds of artisans and builders, loan sharks, slumlords, all kinds of other interesting political economic processes are driving the city forward. So there is a limit to urban planning, especially the kind of urban planning that we're doing at the moment. It needs to be much more informed by the perspectives of people living in the informal settlements and working in the informal economy. There are lots of examples of this that I can talk about. One is the whole burgeoning discourse on barefoot planners. Barefoot planning basically comes from the idea of barefoot doctors in China that were semi-trained, quasi-professional medical professionals that delivered services to China's burgeoning population. They weren't, hyper-educated, they weren't super qualified, but they could get the job done. And increasingly, people are using this concept in urban planning, where they're using people from local communities to broker trust and insert local contextually relevant innovations in planning processes that deliver much more equitable outcomes. And this was done in Cape Town, and as a result of that, one slum settlement that was marked for demolition and eviction, the work of barefoot planners revealed that there were far fewer people living in the settlement than the government thought that there were. So they did not lead to eviction. So in Accra, in Ghana, the opposite happened, where suddenly the government realized by engaging with barefoot planners that there are far too many people living there. And therefore, they decided that they couldn't handle the displacement that eviction would result in. So yes, we need to look at planning differently. And then I think there's a need to look at urban systems. Far too much money and effort is invested in hard infrastructure. I think I'm in a building full of engineers, so I'm a little worried about what I'm going to say here. But I think we need to balance this emphasis on hard infrastructure with a sharp focus on capability development. 98% of all the money that went from the global environmental facility to towns and cities between 2010 and 2015 went into infrastructural development. Where is the emphasis on building up people's capacities to deal with other people? During COVID-19, all of us have seen the importance of concepts such as adaptive management, where you have to open and close public spaces and public transport with a rise and fall in risk, in this case infection numbers, where you might have to suddenly have the skill to repurpose parts of the city. In New York City, bus lanes in certain neighborhoods were converted into bike lanes because people stopped using buses during COVID-19, and there was a massive uptick in the use of bicycles. You have to kind of orient people in embracing these shifts, people who run critical urban systems. And finally, none of this is possible without the right kind of financing. Current finance that largely emanates from international financing institutions for building resilience is far too slow, far too static, and far too difficult to access. If there is a humanitarian crisis, by the time you submit a proposal to the World Bank for funding, it's about 6 years, and a whole new crisis is brewing. So we need to pivot towards more nimble, more effective modes of financing, such as urban resilience bonds. Yes, again, not a silver bullet, but is demonstrating impact across scale. Cape Town raised money through a municipal bond to deal with its water crisis. Indonesia raised $1.3 billion through a green bond for doing all kinds of interesting work on climate adaptation and mitigation. So yes, the context is changing, and we need to shift our approaches from managing risk to humanitarian crises. Thank you.
And we will just pass the mic down. Thank you so much, Adita.
Hi everybody, I'm Amelia Wu. I'm the Global Shelter Lead at NRC, Norwegian Refugee Council. So I'm very much a practitioner. I am not a climate change expert, but I would really like to talk to you today a little bit about the observations I've made over the last few years where the shelter sector has been trying to gear up to a certain degree to meet the changing needs in our sector due linked often to climate change, but also to look quite carefully at our own environmental impact in our programming. So I'm just going to talk about 3 different things. 5 was a bit of a stretch, I think, so I'll stick to 3. So one is that we had a really interesting pre-discussion today about looking at the use of low impact materials, which was really rich and really informative. But I often find that when the shelter sector is challenged in its use of construction materials and reducing its environmental impact, that we are told to very much focus on the products that we are using and find alternatives. This product focus doesn't necessarily give us the opportunity to think about the full the focus on the product doesn't give us the opportunity to think about the full process of our work, the full project management cycle, and to really investigate the more systemic side of what that looks like. Secondly, that focus on product often leads us into a conversation about innovation and looking to find new innovative solution to a different kind of material or a different kind of technology which can help us still do what we're doing, but reduce our impact and not make us feel so bad about it. And the focus is often on high tech rather than low tech. And there is always a challenge of scale, of suitability and adaptability in different local contexts across the globe. Thirdly, if we want to move away from this product focus, then I think we really need to put as much energy as we do in looking at low impact materials into looking at other forms of sheltering that we use as commonplace in the sector. So, can we look more at hosting? We've seen recently in the Ukraine crisis that hosting families or hosting individuals has been a large part of the collective response to look after the people that are displaced and refugees that are leaving Ukraine. So how can we focus on that and look at how that could be scaled up and be safer? So over the last few months at NRC, we've been looking at how we sort of have a roadmap towards becoming carbon neutral. So this has opened up a lot of very, very interesting discussions and areas of work, because going carbon neutral doesn't just mean that our operations and our offices are carbon neutral, but also the programs that we are implementing for our project participants, for the families that we serve, are also carbon neutral. So how do we make sure that through our efforts to set a good example, to be globally visible in making an effort to reduce impact on climate, how do we make sure that the efforts aren't just transferred into risk, into a reduction in the level of support that we are providing to beneficiaries? We had a carbon mapping or an exercise to look at our carbon footprint at NRC, and Shelter and Settlements Department didn't fare very well. So there was a focus on the amount of concrete that is used in our infrastructure programming. Our portfolio also includes the construction of schools, and we're often working in countries where concrete is, as it is here, the go-to material for community infrastructure and city-level infrastructure. And some of the advice from consultants was to stop using concrete. As you can imagine, this is a bit challenging, especially in a few of the countries that we work in. Then the local governments or the national governments actually have a large stake in the cement factories that are in each region of their country. So, this isn't something, there isn't a silver bullet by just stopping using concrete, but we can investigate what kind of materials we could use instead, or in what context we can look at alternative materials and low impact materials. But often the gut reaction is to think about new and innovative products, as I said, without necessarily drawing this design solution from an existing problem. My job partly involves responding to very well-meaning engineers, architects and designers who have emailed me and said, I found the perfect solution to the humanitarian shelter crisis. It is, no offense to anyone, it is this recycled plastic interlocking block.
3D printed.
It's 3D printed, it's hollow inside, and you can store water and food in it as well. You can give this out as a distribution, and then afterwards you can use it to build a shelter. So, I don't want us to stop being innovative, but I want us to really focus on co-creation, on starting with the problem and looking at that problem locally, contextually, building on vernacular architecture, building on the experience and the expertise that exists in the locations where we're working. We want to be able to operate at scale, but what does scale actually mean? Does it mean that we want to have a solution that we can that we can roll out across the whole globe? Or does scale mean that perhaps we focus on a particular geographic region and reinforce and support the improvement of a practice that is already present there? Innovation doesn't always have to be high tech. Innovation can be low tech, but it's very difficult to convince innovation donors and funds that that is equally, if not more, valuable. And without that level of buy-in and the innovation being led at a community level, then we're not going to see the behaviour change that we want to see. And it's only the behaviour change which is going to give us the scale that we need. The other key, I haven't got that many minutes yet, but the other key aspect of this is that without market assessments and local market assessments and the understanding of demand and supply, then these products aren't going to be sustainable. They aren't going to be a solution which has the impact that we need. So, where was I? So my final point. I was trying to think yesterday, thinking through the shelter portfolio, what we often refer to as the palette of options that we have in our paint box or in our toolbox as a shelter practitioner. What is the lowest impact? What solution does have the lowest impact? And this will range from location to location and crisis to crisis. But as we are seeing an increase in populations living in urban areas, and we've seen recently with the Ukraine crisis, we do need to be able to respond in urban areas, and hosting solutions are more and more prominent, and they're not just being set up by international organisations. So, British government just set up a host family program, which many of you might have heard about, but none of us have seen much outcome yet. But but we're not going to be the only actors looking at how to do hosting better. But I really encourage us to look at opportunities where we can advocate for more welcoming housing solutions, where we're building on these hosting arrangements and promoting perhaps the benefit of migration. And perhaps we don't have an issue of, perhaps having IDPs or refugees or migration across borders isn't necessarily our problem. It isn't a bad thing. Migration is actually a way of coping with climate change, and we see that in the natural world. It's a coping mechanism. How can we better support that so that it is safe and provides sustainable solutions, and perhaps change that narrative as well and use our voice, our advocacy work to try and flip that narrative that actually this could be a really valuable experience for both hostees and hosted individuals. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. I've got a few other things, but I'm sure the conversation will continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amelia.
Right, thanks. Hello, good evening. This is it's very nice to be here and not in Bangladesh for some time. Much as Bangladesh is very nice and particularly vulnerable to the rising climate. I'm here, I work there for the FCDO, the new DFID at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, but I'm not here on their official, like what I say is not their position. I represent my thoughts here as an independent who's been working in this field for way too long, or like a long time. I was just thinking back to work in the Bosnia conflict in 1992, where we responded to mass displacement in the shelter and water and other engineering sectors. And since then, as a kind of humanitarian nomad going between different responses. And since then, and the impacts of sudden onset or slow onset climate events. So I think it's a really relevant question. The question is the sector, let's say shelter or humanitarian sector, ready for changing climates, right? And I'm going to argue that we are not, and we are nowhere close ready for the scale of change that's coming, right? I think what do the models tell us? We heard a little bit earlier that it's not looking great. Whatever report you look at, it's either 1.5, 2.5, whatever, and we know that those degrees mean mega, sort of seismic change in terms of an area being habitable, especially rural areas, being able to grow food anymore, being able to get materials for your shelter and so on. And so we know that that is probably going to lead to large scale migration, if not at first, but slowly over time. And NRC actually and others have already done some research over the last 10 years looking at, is climate change driving migration? The answer isn't exactly a simple yes, it's a contributing factor that leads to conflict over resources that are left and then slowly migration. The large numbers of migrants coming to Europe now from Chad, Niger, Eritrea, and so on are going for work, we understand, work because their agricultural work no longer provides an income. So yes, it's driven by that. But I want to talk about three experiences I have found, field realities. One is from 2019 in northern Mozambique. As you may remember, there was a major cyclone that hit the eastern side of Mozambique. I was 2 days after Kenneth, which was the most ferocious cyclone that hit the eastern side of Africa on record, whatever. And it demolished things. 50,000 houses were just wiped out, and all the buildings, schools, clinics, gone. Remarkably, not that many people died. No, that was really intense. And that was definitely, or most likely linked to some climate event. Then there was in Pakistan, 2012, 7 days of rain, an extreme cloud outburst event that destroyed 480,000 houses over 7 days, right? So it's 480,000 families were homeless in 7 days, and they had just been flooded out the year before by the 2010 floods, the two. Yeah. Anyway, and then there's the Afghanistan drought, 2018, went on for a few years, and 480 or 500,000 people were displaced from that into moving into urban areas. So these are three examples. So it's very much happening already. If it gets much worse, these are just going to happen more. What I've been seeing is that the responses that we have are nowhere near big enough for those kind of numbers of people that are affected. Even the smallest one, the Cabo Delgado, northern Mozambique one, we were able to respond to a really tiny percentage, much less than 10% of those people, with what? Some plastic sheeting and some bit of tools and some buckets and stuff. And that's not really a shelter response. A shelter response would be supporting them to rebuild homes with local materials in an affordable way that could be more resilient to the next cyclone that's probably going to come. And in the Pakistan case, we did a massive response. The UK government, UK taxpayers' money paid for, after that one, something like 50,000 families to get flood resilient housing going forward, just using local earth and stabilized with lime. We talked about it earlier today. So yeah, we can do a lot. 50,000 compared to 480,000, not a lot, maybe 10%. Now, so we're not resourced enough. I also think that the landscapes that we have made, the man-made landscape, denuded soils, and deforestation has made millions of people so much more vulnerable. When anything happens, the land only kind of works against them. The water isn't held up high, it creates a flood, and so on. So this is a major problem. And of course, there's now less money and more crises. And the money that we have is worth less now, because in a humanitarian response, the single biggest sector that requires funding is food. It goes to WFP. So you take your 100 million, whatever, and give 60 million of it to WFP. That's the way the humanitarian system works. All the other sectors get whatever's left of 40%, pretty much. And food is just going to become, I haven't seen it go up yet, but because of Ukraine and flour and oil and stuff, apparently it's going to go up. So that's not great looking forward. And we've had some economic crises that are reducing it. Secondly, we are not preparing, I don't think, the shelter sector for this. We don't have local communities of practice that we talked about today in these areas of the affected areas of Africa, Europe, Middle East, Pakistan, etc., which would be academia, operational actors, donors, and so on, to talk about what works. Did that stabilized land thing, was that bamboo project really good? What could work if in a scenario that a good percentage of our country was going to be displaced because of some crazy climate event? How can we improve our response? There isn't. There aren't any community. We tried really hard at Pakistan. I was in Pakistan 4 years. By the end of it, we had a couple of meetings as community practice, then it sort of fizzled out. In Nepal, there for 3 years after the earthquake, we tried, academia was a bit involved. We didn't. There is a little bit more community practice there, but very weak. We need to develop material supply chains so that we have enough bamboo and so on for the initial phases. We talked today about bamboo supply chains. It's really weak in almost everywhere in the world. Bangladesh is the only country where there's a lot of it produced, well, Thailand, Indonesia as well, but in the South Asia. In Africa, it's really bad. You could grow tons of bamboo there. We're not developing this sector. Forestry departments are busy selling standing timber to the Middle East, China. This is definitely not FCDO policy, by the way, but that's what I saw. Cabo Delgado was covered, it's north of Mozambique, with huge standing timber. Now it's denuded to pieces because of 80 years, in the last 20, 30 years, corruption, paying people in the capital to sell it to high payers. They're doing the same with the ocean, selling all their fish to. It's really frustrating because it is actually driving climate crisis. We're not investing in human capital in all of these sorts of skills. So I'd say delivery experience to respond, is a combination of material and human capacity. All right, we need both of them. We're not about either of them. And I would say we're making it worse because of denuded landscapes. Because that is an example of in South Sudan, and a colleague has shared a video of this. She goes with a temperature gauge where you point at the ground, and it's 65 degrees on the ground in the open sun. In the shade with one remaining tree, it's 40 degrees. Right? 20-degree difference. 65 degrees is really damn hot, right? The soil gets thrashed under that. Everything living there is dead. And so when the rain falls, it dissipates and thrashes the soil even more. Why are those trees cut? For growing charcoal, for making charcoal, and for building houses. The shelters there use a design of chopping whatever timber you got about that diameter and making a circle, tuple, a hut, and then the roof is made of the same damn material. And it's just not a great design. And all these are tens of thousands of families returning from being displaced or refugees or whatever. And they come and they go, got to build a house. Okay, cut. Oh God, there's nothing left to cut, and shit, there's nothing to grow food in. Now we're really stuck. So we do it to ourselves. In that case, they say that's the South Sudan, but we are there. Humanitarian development community is there. We're not changing. We're not offering an alternative and so on. We're not using the waste borders to regenerate the soil. That's another example. There's a lot of uninhabited areas. I'm seeing the likelihood of mass migration, large-scale migration as the climate gets worse, where towards like Europe, because you're not going to, if you take from the Middle East, large parts of Asia, we're already seeing large-scale migration from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, etc. There's large parts of uninhabitable areas in those countries because of these things. And they're not going to go north towards, China or Russia, right? They're going to try and come here. I see a really scary migration crisis coming not too far. And so it's a combination of both shelter and environment management and landscape management, not just about shelter. But there are lots of nice and good and great examples that we can draw on, that we talked about earlier today, the large-scale bamboo use. And one really interesting one, Loess Plateau in China. If you haven't looked it up, definitely look it up, Loess Plateau, China, 1994. It's a large area, about the size of Belgium, I think, and it was denuded completely, and 50 million people were there and were migrating out, right? Huge food security crisis, and it was a $500 million project to regenerate and reforest the area, and it kind of worked. And the video shows it all. A short video called "Hope in a Changing Climate" trailer. Look at that one. In 3 minutes, you will see what they can do. And it is absolutely possible. He talks about Ethiopia and other places in that as well. So there are great models, but I don't think we're investing in them. So to answer to the question, are we ready? I think not.
Thank you very much.
My notes are on my computer, so I'm a bit clear. So I'm hopefully going to touch on some of the things that have come up, which is a relief because I wasn't sure what the rest of the panel was going to talk about. But I'm definitely going to be picking up on Aditya's point about data, and I'm going to throw out some of the terminology as well, just to put the words out there so you can start making the connections as well. I'm definitely going to be talking about innovation and some of the other dynamics that are at play. I feel like, I should also say I haven't done anything in the humanitarian sector since 2013, and I have also not been able to speak at anything because because I was so full of like rage and guilt, and because I think it's a kind of really racist system, and I really couldn't even read anything about it. So I know a lot of people in the room, but they probably haven't seen me, don't know where I've been for a decade. So also that. Anyway, let me get to it. I'm going to talk about three different things. One is, apart from the climate emergency, what else is happening that is useful to think about, and things that I think about as an engineer. The critical part of the talk, which is how does money flow to risky things? In 1992, was the Bosnia crisis. I was actually doing my GCSEs, and we studied global warming. I always feel like the teaching of this has been going on for a long time, but we talked about global warming, and it was very much about a creeping rising temperature, and not about volatility. So how money flows to risky things is a lot about the kind of maths and wobbly stuff, and I'm going to talk about that because that's what I've been working on since Shelter. And then lastly, I wanted to make a couple of points about how we are changing the way we talk and think about these things since the last time I was in these conversations. Just as a note of optimism in my apocalyptic worldview. Apart from the climate emergency, what's the problem? So in 2008, I was working in Jordan, and I was working for a Jordanian company, a sustainability consultancy. And one of the documents I had to read was a document that had been published by an investment company called Abraj Capital. And these are like verbatim, I looked it up before I did this. And some of the things that report said were, oil and gas prices are highly correlated. Nitrogen fertilizer plants in the EU and the US are shutting down because of these high gas prices. The surge in food demand in Brazil, India, and China is having a massive impact on demand for fertilizer. China can produce its own fertilizer supply to meet its domestic needs. So it's not having an impact on global prices. India makes up for 20% of the global demand for fertilizer. So it is and does have an impact on global prices. And the move in the US towards biofuels, which meant more corn was being grown, meant land turnover to kind of corn acreage was like super fertilizer intensive. So the US's efforts to reduce their dependence on oil and gas from the MENA region had the opposite effect and made them more dependent on oil and gas biofertilizer. So that landed, so this has just come back into the news, right? Suddenly everyone's like, oh, there's a Haber process and methane makes fertilizer, and this is absolutely critical for the entire global food challenge, as you mentioned. But I had that in my mind, must have had that in my mind when I went to Haiti in 2010. Because I remember coming back, and several times I came back, and one of the things I found really discombobulating about returning was just like being in London and just seeing the abundance, just being kind of disgusted by the abundance. And what I remember saying to my family, we call it civilization, but what we mean is cheap food and cheap energy. And this issue, it's not just about land, as you mentioned, it's about the seas. You know, a lot of commentators, or some commentators, observe the military maneuvers in the Arctic and the military maneuvers in the South China Sea to be about protein, because that's where the fish is for Russia, that's where the fish is for China. So where the stuff is really matters. And you might have also seen an article by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's the WTO Director General, those I'm sure you know. But she was talking about if that is the food and energy nexus, she was talking about the kind of infrastructure and trade nexus, about the congestion on land, the kind of neglected hinterland of road and rail infrastructure, the difficulty of offloading, unloading cargo, shortage of staff, weak digital infrastructure to move things, to move signals down the supply chains, and disruptions at borders and the processing at borders and climate change. And the thing that she said that we all know really is that all of this was especially problematic in developing nations, landlocked countries, and small island states, all of which are vulnerable to the changing climate as well. So where the stuff in the world matters, and that story about Abraj Capital, it's as much about the nexus as the fact that it was Abraj Capital that had noticed this. Like, people have noticed, right? And money's been made from that. But the other part of this, and this is what I'm going to come on to now, is there was a book from about 20 years ago called Splintering Urbanism, and it had this idea in it that I really latched onto probably as an engineer, this kind of striking and intractable problem of what they call privilege and bypass, the way that built infrastructure is configured, and then it embeds systems of privilege and systems of bypass. And you can explore that from another direction, which is to think about it as infrastructure, or hard infrastructure often, as a way of neutralizing risk that we've come to rely on. So it operates in a way like a kind of insurance. So I'm going to come back to this idea of insurance in a second, because there's some other things, like very innovative things that happen not in welfareist economies like ours, but I'll come on to that. Hopefully that, I'm not a big advocate for all hard infrastructure, but I do think there's a subtlety around, there's a lot to explore around what we mean by hard and what we mean by soft, and this is where I want to go next. So the next thing I wanted to think about was this idea of how you get money to flow to risky things. Why did I care about this question 10 years ago? It's because lots of the buildings in Haiti were not destroyed, they were damaged. Lots of the buildings in Pakistan were not destroyed, they were damaged. The solutions were very much what you do when something's disappeared. They weren't what you do when something that was probably not engineered in the first place needs to be repaired. Because let's say we design homes and buildings and we take into account, as engineers, we take into account sometimes earthquakes, always wind, and sometimes floods, surface water, rivers, or in London, surface, drains overflowing and so on. And we always take into account rain. We've always got roof. We take into account heat and cold, often both. Sometimes damp, sometimes fire, and of course location and tenure of course. But I'm not going to talk about that today. But money flows to that infrastructure when the person paying thinks that those things I've just mentioned are kind of taken care of, or the things they know about are taken care of. So, and I call this like underwriting, just to suggest to you that there's like a web of invisible confidence-inducing assurances, not necessarily insurance, but assurances that are kind of at play when you decide to spend money on housing. And actually, this is where I name check Joey, because thinking again about insurance, it was Joey that said to me many years ago that it's not risk that insurers have a problem with, it's unquantified risk. And anyone who's in the Pakistan reconstruction after 2005, there was a big argument between the World Bank, who wanted to rebuild reinforced concrete structures that they could account for in their traditional ways of measuring whether it would just resist an earthquake, and rolling out a viable program for people who couldn't get cement on the mountainside, that didn't rely on that technology. And actually, that was a rare occasion where the World Bank were defeated and what was rolled out was something quite different. But if the money won't come, if there aren't guarantees there somewhere. So what I did to answer that question is to think about a different problem. And this is, I really tried to try and make the links, and I think I'm not going to bother to try and make the links, I'm going to let you make them. But this problem is a different problem. It's the problem of European housing that is really expensive to heat and too cold. And the problem is not the retrofit after an earthquake or repair, it's an energy retrofit. So, and a lot of the problems are similar, right? So I've been doing some work with the demolition of social housing in London that was often being demolished on the basis that it was environmentally out of date and unsound and too operationally expensive to run. So I ended up working for a startup that was developing Internet of Things technology to measure the thermal signature of the building, and a home. And what that technology can do, what that data can do, is it filters out what the humans are doing and it focuses on what the infrastructure is doing, like how well is it holding warming. So once you can do the hypothesis is, once you can measure that, because it's never been measured at any kind of scale before, once you can measure it, then you can invest in it, because people would rather invest in a power station where you know how much the power station costs and you can measure what comes out of it, than they would invest in thousands, millions of individual homes where you don't know how much your investment will cost. You don't know if it's made any difference, and you can't ever measure the return on your investment. So that was the theory, and in fact, it played out, and we managed to solve the technical problem of can you measure it. We did that, and then we were joined together with a massive German insulation company who wanted to use this technology to underwrite their investment in housing. So a lot of the that's a short story, but it just gives you an idea of what you can do if you think about the traditional way that you model a building or design it. I call it one engineer, one building. The other extreme of thinking about your whole population of buildings, and at the moment we have things like fragility curves and other tools for thinking about like the risk at scale of different types of buildings. And you have some intermediate modeling things that you can do where you know a bit about buildings. And then there's a whole kind of gap where, especially in the domestic sector, you don't really know anything about those buildings if they're informal. And some parts of residential energy in Europe are incredibly informal, as in we don't know anything about them and people improvise them. So a lot of the same questions come up as we asked. How much do we need to spend per house now for this investment to last into the future? When does it cost too much to fix something and you should just start again from scratch? How will engineers react to the switch away from really elaborate, because in this country we do these really elaborate house surveys. They come up with the wrong answer. They're very technical but wrong, which I hate. And what we really need is actually craft, a combination of kind of craft and the people who know how to build and the data. So where are engineers in that? And do they have a problem with this shift? Yes, we found they did. It was really very difficult at a government level when all the government's technical advisors were stuck in an old paradigm to try and tell them machine learning might be a different solution and might be the way forward. Can the government accept a shift regulation that is about trying to control all the materials that go onto the market and just say, we're moving to a way of measuring the outcome that consumers can have in their hands? More importantly, who ends up with the data from this kind of shift? And will money get transferred in kind of retrofit-sized investments? Can you get a green bond to be broken down into small, tiny bits of finance for many, many houses? There's a lot of challenges in there about how we incrementally shift or improve the built environment. So I don't know how much of that story is going to land, but we can talk about it afterwards. But the other thing I wanted to talk about is just how we change the way we speak about things. So I guess I would, so there are two massive things that I feel have changed. There has been the Me Too movement, which has affected the humanitarian sector as well, in HQ offices and in programs. Black Lives Matter have also brought to kind of global consciousness, after hundreds of years of fighting, the nexus of kind of racism and capitalism. And honestly, I mean, there's so much work to do, it's not true, but I have people that I would never have imagined saying the word decolonize are trying to educate themselves. And it's like, I'm a bit gobsmacked by this. So I tend to carry around this kind of like permanent rage about binaries in the world. I think because basically I prefer it if it's binary, but actually I get really annoyed when it is. But in this, but I wanted to wrap it up by trying to sort of talk about Wakanda, actually, because I wanted to just see if anyone was writing about a different kind of paradigm where we think about, where we realized one of the amazing things about Wakanda is they had an energy source which gave this kind of social and political power. And I tried to find something about it out there, and there's a lot of back and forth about so I'm going to read you 2 quotes, and then I'll finish, because I'm not an expert on this topic, but I just want to open it up. So I read one thing which said, many of the trends of canonical modern Western cities can be seen in hyperbolic guise. Lagos is not catching up with us, rather we may be catching up with Lagos. And I thought that was really interesting, and then I found out a bit more about who'd written it and under what circumstances, and I found a really good criticism of that by James Ferguson. Don't know if you've heard of him, look him up, amazing. But he said this instead, what we think of as the key works of Southern or post-colonial theory that have emerged not from a pure kind of South, but from points of juncture and crossing, often involving the intersection of the institutional support of Northern universities with personal and political commitments of lives lived, at least partly elsewhere, was the quote I wanted to leave you with, because much as I criticised and felt like full of rage about the humanitarian system, what I think we need to remember is it gives everyone who's crossed the threshold of someone's house and been into the intimate domain of their home and been challenged and observed from a distance what they've done, a chance to bring that thinking back to where they came from and take it out again. And we are in one of those crossing points today, and I hope we can have a good discussion.
So thank you so much to our 4 panelists. And what I'd like to do now is open up the floor for questions. So please stick your hand up, and Evie is going to take a microphone, mostly for the Zoom audience that we have, but please do put your hand up if you have a question. Yes.
Thank you. You mentioned the sort of the shift in risks and shocks, and the need for the scale up in humanitarian shelter response, but equally a need for increased sustainability of that response. Do you have any examples of good shifts in thinking, positive shifts in thinking, even if they're not of the necessary scale yet, or see any opportunities of responding to both of those challenges?
So perhaps we could go to Amelia first. Do you think that's something that you could address?
Possibly, yeah.
If you could pass up the mic, that would be great. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, I think when I talked a little bit more about, the shift that we are seeing in terms of international NGOs making commitments to reduce their carbon footprints, and whether these commitments are coming from a genuine place or whether regardless of the motivation, let's say, I think that the process of international organisations going through what most the organisations are called greening the response, or greening the orange, or greening the blue, then I think there's an opportunity from learning there. Because if we're looking at solutions that can reach scale, if we start from looking at in-house and start looking at what we can do in our operations ourselves, then in a lot of situations that is addressing something at scale. And the process of us going through that, the process of organisations such as NRC hiring energy expertise, reviewing our procurement systems, reviewing our transport, looking at looking at the packaging when we do buy things, then I think the whole process, that whole reflective process will also offer opportunities for how we can then adapt programming, but also just be really, just test new approaches at a local level as well, because we're not just talking about our office in Geneva or office in Oslo or New York. If organisations are going to go carbon neutral, then that needs to go right down to the office in Bangui and the area office in Central African Republic, in Cagabandoro. You know, what can we offer at that local level, which then sets an example or tests and pilots different solutions at that local level, which could then cause ripple effects in the local community. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, which I'm excited to see. So I'm really hoping that we can benefit from bringing our operations to actually having a ripple effect at the local level.
Thanks, Amelia. Does anyone else on the panel like to address that? Would anyone else on the panel like to address that question? Or should we move to the next one?
Positive things.
Positive only.
Oh, positive, I've got to be positive. Okay, increased sustainability at scale and shelter stuff. Not really. Not at scale. Sorry, but not at scale. At scale has been the Nepal government's response to the earthquake, where 800,000 houses were destroyed or damaged. So certainly weren't all destroyed, about half of them were fully destroyed. And they gave a $3,000 per equivalent per family response. Yeah. Most of it was paid by the Nepal government, borrowed money from the future. Donors gave about there's $2.4 billion. Donors gave about $500 million. So whatever. Now, sustainable? Not really. The shelter design was reinforced concrete corners and a banding and so on. Bit of banding, so earthquake compliant, roughly. 2 tiny rooms, the size of what we're on here. So when they have much bigger houses. But anyway, it shows that you can act at scale. You could do it at scale. After the Pakistan earthquake in 2005, the Pakistan government and partners did the same for a little bit less, 650,000 houses. So point is, that's pretty impressive. This sort of, is it sustainability? No. They didn't address any of the landscape or any of the environmental sustainability or look at more sustainable supply chains. Because you can't at scale. We talked about it today. There are no low impact materials that you can get at scale up to some mountain villages or anywhere. You can get it to very small pilots. There was a straw bale, there was a rammed earth, there was a this in a few, 5 or 6 or 10. That's not scale.
I've got one. So there is a project which I've been trying to find out about for like 15 years. So there was a shelter response in Afghanistan where it was mud building, and a decision was made where they distributed timber, window frames and door frames, but with like extended lintels that went into mud. If anyone knows about that case study and can share it, I would love that. But I love that example because it was that 20% change that gave 80% of the difference. Anyway.
Sure, but probably quite small.
Probably, yeah.
So all the nice little projects are small.
Yeah.
So the one that UK taxpayers paid for in Pakistan with the lime stabilized soft was 110,000 houses. Probably one of the biggest that's been done. And at scale, at low, that was pretty sustainable, low carbon, all that stuff, very cheap too. Anyway.
Next questions. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Savin from MSc program. In the context of fragility conflict violence, the FCV setting, when there is transboundary migration of the affected population, whom we call refugees. Across the world, the last decade has seen many instances of such migration, whether it Latin America, US borders, or many entry points across the European Union. So we have come across the instances of violation of the Geneva Convention on Refugees and 1967 Protocol and the principle of non-refoulement. So I just wish to know that what is the legal position, what is the legitimate position in this regard, and if there have been violations, then what punitive action or what penal action has been proposed in the international forum like UN agencies, UN OCHA, or United Nations humanitarian agencies against the countries who have conducted such violations.
So this is an enormous question around
Yeah.
But do you have a particular perspective on shelter? Is this a shelter question? Perhaps we can narrow it a little.
The humanitarian crisis has unfolded in a big way.
Sorry.
The humanitarian crisis has unfolded in a big way across all such instances where such populations have been forced to live across the borders.
Yes, we understand.
Yeah.
We understand the point, but we're just wondering whether you can reframe it in a shelter context.
I can have the answers in the shelter context.
I don't think you can. I think it's a valid question. I think everybody, the humanitarian, the world community has seen large numbers of people move. I would say refugees more are the ones where non-refoulement applies. So everybody else in the room, non-refoulement is, I'm not sure where it's set, it's international humanitarian law, whereby a country is obliged to accept people who are fleeing persecution and their lives. Right? So that's the state in the United Nations Charter, I think, or humanitarian law that exists. The problem is it's almost never applied. Otherwise, the whole of the refugees coming out of Syria, for example, would have been accepted in large scale. Instead, we did a deal with Turkey to keep them there, and they did a pretty good job, I think. They gave them freedom of movement within Turkey and freedom to find work, go to school, and so on. I think kudos to Turkey on that front. But I'm sure there were lots of challenges. But I agree, it's not related to shelter. It's a much bigger human rights thing. And many people are concerned, like now the doors are opening to refugees from Ukraine, but the doors did not open to refugees from other countries. So it's kind of double standards. We know we get that for sure. But at the same time, I would say that within African states, Uganda, for example, has been taking, there's been a huge refugee recipient from South Sudan, DRC, and other places. So it's sort of almost they take regionally. In Bangladesh, they've taken 1 million people from Myanmar and continue to host them and so on. Pakistan and Iran took for 30 years tens of millions of refugees from Afghanistan. And so it has, to some extent, it's been, those states should be recognized for the enormous effort that they have done. I think Lebanon as well is top of the charts for taking the largest amount per percentage of their population. Like 35% of Lebanon is now refugees. What would that look like in the UK? So, but I don't think it's really, but we can't really go there for shelter.
Perhaps we should move to the next question. Zoe.
I want to ask the question, is the humanitarian sector ready for climate change, but from a slightly different perspective? Are the people working in it really ready to make it a priority? And it comes back a bit to what Kate was saying about learning about climate change when we were at school, and this being around, we've known about climate change for a very long time, but people were not ready. I'll take the UK example. People were not ready to make significant changes. Right now they are. The amount of meat that's being eaten, the policies that are coming out. at every level. Even today, I was at a thing at UCL where they now say, you know, no meat food, it's just vegetarian, it's part of our sustainability, you know, objective. Are people in the humanitarian sector, are the bosses, are the leaders, are the donors, are the government, who is it who's actually going to make sure that it's a priority? And hence, that's why I'm asking the same question, are you ready? But actually, is it the people are ready to really make it a priority?
Who would like to take that, please?
I can start. I definitely would say it is becoming one of the main priorities. And I hope it isn't just a new buzzword. I really hope, and I honestly don't think it is. We're seeing by September this year, ECHO will be enforcing their environmental minimum commitments and recommendations for all of the organisations receiving their grants. In response, organisations are developing their own internal environmental standards. And I think perhaps one of my hopes is that we can actually all work together and bring some of these efforts into more of a collective front rather than individually working on how we deal with minimising our environmental impact internally. But yes, it is a priority, but there is a risk that it is sometimes seen as another thematic that we need to mainstream across our work. And I think, coming from a shelter perspective, we've got a lot of people that have trained and worked in the built environment. We are well positioned to have a certain level of training and understanding of what we can do to at least start to address and mitigate our impact, which might not necessarily be the case in other sectors because it is so much part of our construction practice as well. But there is a risk that it could be a tick box exercise. And we could see it going away. It's gone for, let's say, participation or inclusion or gender. But I think that there is more of a groundswell overall change and focus on the environment, on climate change, outside of the sector globally, in our younger generations. And I really hope that because of that we are actually going to maintain the momentum that I feel that is picking up right now. And I'm really actually trying to be very positive about this. So yeah.
Okay, just have one other. Yeah. I wonder, on the point of privilege or bypass, I hope and I'm sure the will is there. The resources, what will happen now to resources from the traditional donor countries when this crisis is just beginning? The drawbridges may well come up, and a lot of the political analysis of, in the aftermath of Trump, in the aftermath of Brexit, is that the falling away of welfare policies in the global north, when they were in place, there was a lot more of a willingness to give to international causes. Because that has fallen away and the division underneath is now exposed, the willingness to give has been really affected by that. So,
if I may, I also like to reframe that key question in a different context. Aditya, we talked about the future of humanitarianism perhaps being more urban. And if we're talking about hosting displaced people, that we're talking about existing cities. So how do you see readiness in terms of what we already have and how that will support the humanitarian sector, perhaps? Or not?
Thanks for that very easy question. Yeah, I think that's a challenge, but I think there are a few rules of conduct that we need to kind of abide by and align with. I think one is that we need to acknowledge that the most marginalized urban citizens are more at risk than those citizens that are not marginalized. There is this understanding that climate change affects us all. Yes, of course it does, but it affects some people much more than other people. So, and in cities, especially in the global south, most of the people who live on unstable slopes, on low-lying areas, are people who are refugees, who are internally displaced, or or suffer from other kinds of marginalization. So we need to recognize that there is this heightened pattern of exposure and vulnerability that is not uniform, and that some certain kinds of populations need to be catered to more than others. And also at the same time, we need to recognize that if these flows of people in and out of cities are not regulated or when I say regulated, I don't mean controlled, but not there's no assistance provided, then inevitably these people who are already fleeing situations of high vulnerability will continue to be trapped in a sort of vulnerability in the host areas. So I think it begins with an acknowledgement of this differentiated vulnerability, which then needs to translate into specifically tailored responses. And I think overall, I haven't seen an elegant response to that yet.
Well, so much for our positivity. we did experience it briefly. Perhaps someone from the side, how about this lady here, please? Oh, yes, you.
So I have a question relating to like big data, sort of in the humanitarian sector as well. So in terms of utilizing big data in cities where they're very vulnerable to the sort of effects of climate change and are still developing, how can the humanitarian sector ensure that this sort of data, whilst it's useful for like a humanitarian response, they can process this data and think of like, a sort of good alternative or good solutions. But then when in terms of like the local market and the people who are maybe in those cities who are living there and sort of local tradesmen and those sort of people who can't really benefit from this data, like how do you manage like having this information but not sort of damaging the actual markets that exist in these countries, and also the sort of implications of like security and I guess like corruption in some of these countries where this data could be used like or misused. How can like it be used in like a sustainable way socially, and sort of not taken advantage of?
So I think when I was talking about big data, I did say I don't think it's a silver bullet. I think there are still big questions, and I think these are precisely the sorts of questions that need to be thought through. I think the original question is, in some of the world's riskiest contexts, you also have really low internet bandwidth that probably doesn't support the kind of high velocity big data collection that some of these experiments that have been carried out in the global north talk about. Basically, what I'm saying is we need to work through these issues, and there are positive examples. So, for instance, in Bangladesh, there's a really interesting experiment about how call detail records, which is basically pinging off people's cell phones, has been proven to be a very effective way of understanding where people are. But that immediately leads to questions of privacy. In this case, what they did was they only accessed and asked for anonymized call detail records. So there wasn't any feasible way of really linking an identity to who you were pinging on, just to understand mobility patterns, should when cyclones strike, and to look at where people go, and then to design a response to that. So I think there are checks and balances that are possible, and I don't think this is big. I mean, it is poignant in the context of big data, but I suspect these sorts of questions are for any kind of data, like census information. Also, in certain countries like mine in India, is really detailed. Who has a bicycle, whose house is built, how many people live where, and who earns what. That kind of data is prone to being hijacked and being misused in a similar way. Just big data, I guess, it becomes easier to collate and understand patterns and then target people. So I guess you have to put in checks and balances. There isn't an easy answer. I certainly don't think we need to reject the whole paradigm of big data because we're worried about these issues, and we'll have very little progress if we start. Worrying, keep treating those as barriers as opposed to things that we need to overcome.
And Kate, you also mentioned that. Would you like to respond?
I think a lot of it comes down to who's collecting it. And so one of the consequences, for example, in the example I gave of having sensors in lots of homes. So homes already there's an address, right, and that's very identifiable. But the interesting thing about that is I started out very critical of the kind of standard paradigm, which I guess would be like a census or a survey, where it's very labour intensive, you have to go and collect it, and then the government has the data, and instead you can just plant a sensor. But as time went on, I realised that the inventory is really powerful and useful for the government to plan. So having data that helps with census data, it's really powerful, and I would rather the government have that data than, not necessarily the census data, but I'd rather the government have that data because policy depends on knowing the answers to those questions. So on the one hand, the census data was very powerful in that it did put data, the results of the analysis of things into the hands of the citizen consumer, which they've never had before and couldn't get from a government inventory. I did sort of change my mind on the importance of that survey data as well. So, and again, I think it comes down to who would want it and why would they want it. Like the models of vulnerability to earthquakes, for example, the fragility covers, like who would want that? Well, insurance companies are interested in that kind of thing. Governments are interested in that kind of thing. Who would want all of the plans of every single house in the city so they could check it? Only the household wants that. Nobody else wants that. Who would want the sensor data? Well, I promise you, you don't want anyone else to have it apart from someone who's trying to find out about infrastructure, because you have to, what would you want your landlord to know? The first question social housing landlords ask us about that data is, does this suggest there's no one living in the house and it's fraud? Well, that was an unexpected, obviously, no one should be surprised I was, but no, don't focus on that. So it's what, who gets to see it, and when you're working with data scientists, the approach I took was you have to game it a little bit with them and say, what would you want your landlord to see? Because however you analyze it, as you analyze it, you're going to see things that you have to not be able to connect with a real life household or human. And when you present it, you need to make sure no one else can ever know that too. But they're humans who are doing the data analysis in big data. It's always a danger. they do, by the way, one thing that everybody does when they have this sparse data is they do what I call kind of data speculation, which is when they will impose on the data immediately prejudicial assumptions. And you really have to be open to challenging those things. And you won't know what your own biases in that situation are, but that's one of the important things when you're faced with, you're lucky enough to have data. Yeah.
Next question, over this side. Yes.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask a different question, but then actually the question about refugees really spoke to me, and I'm hoping to actually reframe that maybe from a shelter perspective. One of the things that angers me to no end is that in some of the Greek islands, we still have refugees and migrants living in tents. Even in winter, when the snow is literally on top of the tents in the European Union, we still have people living in tents. And I think that brings up this issue of permanence, which seems to be a bit of a dirty word in the shelter sector, where most governments, local authorities don't particularly want displacement to be permanent. And there are contexts where the shelter cluster, for instance, says, I'm working on a project right now in a context where the shelter cluster says we do not want to be working put cinder blocks in the context of displaced persons, because that gives off this era of permanence, and we don't want that. So what should the humanitarian sector be doing in responding to these kinds of circumstances? Because oftentimes we see that less permanent shelters are less adapted to climate change, to flooding, typhoons, etc. What is this a question of advocacy that needs to be done? What are sort of interventions that shelter actors should be undertaking in these sorts of circumstances? Because we often see that this basically can turn permanent as well, right? Like with Palestinian refugee camps and all over the Middle East. What can the humanitarian sector do?
Yeah, and I think this is going to be an increasing problem if we do see increased displacements with increases in climate change impacts, but also we were discussing a little earlier about returning. And I'm not saying there's a huge amount of evidence, but there are some situations in which people are less likely to return to their homes because of climate impacts, including drought, simply, as we heard, destroying their farms. So who would like to take this question? It's a big one.
I'll have a shot at that.
Sorry.
That's a great question. Kind of relates to the one earlier we heard about refugees. But I like it because you're sort of regionally specific. You're talking about refugees that arrived in Europe, yeah, and which will face, the cold. So we talk in shelter about thermally responsive housing. You can't have somebody live. You talked about heat inside the house as well, the capacity for insulation. If you're in a tent, there is no insulation. The concept, so it's really important. You could say it's like a right, dignity. In the shelter sector, we talk about appropriate housing with privacy and dignity. That's sort of what we try and achieve, you're holding up to. But in the cases, if there's snow on top of tents in Greece, in the European Union, we are far from meeting that. It's interesting because the Greek authorities probably are the ones saying, do not build anything more permanent because we don't want these people staying here. The Bangladeshi authorities are saying exactly the same about the Rohingya in the camps in Cox's Bazar. Like, you can't build, they're in shelters, 200,000 shelters that needs to be repaired every year or so.
That's happening all over the world.
Yes. So, what is it? It's difficult because this is a nation-state decision, not the humanitarian sector. We perform as service providers to the nation-states, pretty much. We receive the nation-state's money, and we provide the services at the request or at the approval of those nation-states. There's Greece, Bangladesh, Uganda, whatever. So we can't do that much. I mean, you should be asking that to, like, what happened to in Calais? What was the name of that camp that was in Calais? Jungle, and whatever. And they came with bulldozers, no? And knocked it down. And that was just like, if that had happened in Bangladesh, there would have been an outcry. How could you do that? That's totally wrong. People, protection of children, separated families. And yet it happened like on our watch in the European Union. So I don't really have an answer to it because the humanitarian sector was not there in Calais. It was small NGOs, and I'm not sure about the NGOs. Are they in Greece? Can you talk about that?
I can't really talk about Greece, but I can talk a little bit more about. I think we do have a responsibility, and a lot of the challenges are linked to restrictions either on the material that is allowed to be used, and those are set at a government level. But we do, as a sector and through the shelter cluster as well, have a responsibility to advocate for the right to adequate housing. And I think we underuse the right to adequate housing, actually.
Is there a right?
There is.
Where?
There's 7 aspects of it as well. It's a human right. housing. I think we don't actually manage to cover that in the UK very often at all. It is freedom from eviction, freedom from damp. Definitely know my flat doesn't have health, privacy, etc., etc. And I actually I call upon everybody. I think we really need to use adequate housing more. I can say that there has been successful advocacy efforts by the sector in other regions, which perhaps we can reflect on and we can use. I was giving this example earlier today in northwest Syria. The same situation, people have been in tents for a decade. Also, this is not good value for money, which we can talk, we can really push that with donors. Repeatedly distributing tents or tarpaulin every 6 months, isn't good value for money. It's not a good use of taxpayers' money. B, it's not good for the environment. We're not going to meet any of the minimum standards for the environment that we're presently discussing by doing that. And C, we're not meeting adequate housing. We're not providing safety. But I think, the one of the issues is giving this portrayal that something is going to be permanent if we are using cement, for example. But I think the discussion needs to happen about what is dignified and what is adequate for the period that people have been displaced. So something, emergency shelter might be adequate if it's the first month of a response, but what's adequate after a year, and what's adequate after 5 years, and what's adequate after 10 years? And through advocacy to predominantly donors in northwest Syria, or on this topic, has finally caused a shift. But the final shift didn't happen until what we were saying, Martin Griffiths, OCHA Emergency Relief Coordinator, visited a family in northwest Syria, and the old lady living in a tent said to him, "I can't lean on a tent." So she hasn't been able to sit in her home and lean back for 10 years, however long she's been there for. And it wasn't really until that clicked that we had a shift globally. So we have a responsibility to influence and advocate to the decision makers. Yes.
This is my best attempt at forcing some tiny bit of positivity, maybe.
Yay.
I'm going to do my best here. And kind of grasping on the Nepal example, Magnus, that you mentioned. I'm not sure if it quite qualifies as conditional cash transfer in that case, but the kind of way that the government responded seems like some kind of model for scaling, disaster response there. I'm wondering, even if we haven't seen that in a particularly environmental way, like Amelia, you were talking about innovation and like material innovation and the case for low-tech innovation, and do we need innovation? Is that the right paradigm here? I'm wondering, are there financial innovations? Are there like innovations in policy that we can look to around the direction of conditional financing, housing microfinance, anything on that kind of front, policies that are suggesting that the landscape here is going in a more positive direction than we might have seen 10 years ago, 15 years ago, in terms of how governments or NGOs can coordinate large-scale, can influence large-scale decentralized procurement for climate resilient or low-impact materials.
Are there any? I mean, I'll grab that first. Do you know much about the projects of Habitat for Humanity and others? And I was going to say the UN Habitat, which is the UN Agency for Urban Development. know? And it's supposed to have put in place some models of microfinance and being able to buy your home in that would be more durable, perhaps along the lines of the resilient cities type initiatives. I've heard it spoken, I've never seen it happen at scale. I know there's the in Karachi, south of Pakistan, the Sindh government is trying to do something like that at scale, but it's largely, they're just building a sort of brick house and letting a poor family go into it. It's generally the model that's also happening in Bangladesh. Possibly for people who are more vulnerable for climate. And it's interesting because that's the development sector initiatives. And as you were saying about IFIs, World Bank, International Financial Institutions, World Bank, ADB, that is much bigger budgets, much longer time frames. They work with government as partners. We, the humanitarian sector, see that as an exotic and foreign and very different experience because it's totally different. They work in a very different way to humanitarians. Yeah. So, but innovation, there's been like the Pakistan and Nepal, they managed to do cash transfers to both at very large scale, open bank accounts for them, and many of them were bankless before. So then they got access to banks, sent that money through, somebody checked, an engineer went out to check that they built the first bit before they got the second tranche. This was all pretty remarkable development, and they were able to shift large amounts of money through the banking system. So I would say that, for me, that's the biggest positive development in that space for a while. But yeah, I want to say about it.
Well, I was just going to maybe expand on the examples of Habitat for Humanity in Jordan. So it's part of, they have a scheme where it's part of a revolving loan. And basically an aspect of it is given for greening your home. So part of the conditionality of the construction loan is that it includes greening aspects to the building. But it's a revolving loan, it goes back into the pot and it goes out to somebody else afterwards. So it's a really nice model. And it works well in stable settings. So I think there's an opportunity there, and there's a conversation I've had with Habitat for Humanity a few times in different roles about how and where can we think about that financing model in less stable environments, if possible.
Thank you for forcing us to be positive. Another interesting positive development is hazard index risk insurance that seems to be growing in scale slowly. Recently, a very interesting experiment took place in one Indian city, Guwahati, its capital of Assam, where UNICEF funded basically a controlled trial where they gave hazard index risk insurance to one set of street vendors and then have a control group. And I think in this case it was indexed to, they said that we give you a insurance payout if there are wind speeds for a storm of a certain amount. I forgot what the wind speed was. And what they actually found was those people who had access to insurance were able to set up their stores twice as quickly as those that did not. So I think it's kind of intuitive. It's strange that they have to do such an expensive control trial and come to a conclusion, but it does demonstrate that there is empirical now evidence that risk insurance allows people to bounce back, and if you tweak it slightly, bounce back better. And I think the example that's been around for ages, but still needs to be scaled and mainstreamed, akin to what you were saying, sort of urban poor funds, which are community pooled resources that are controlled by local institutions. And Slum Dwellers International has done this extensively, where people pool in resources and can use those pooled resources to repair damaged houses or rebuild, and then the community expects them to pay it back into the pot. And they have, of course, mechanisms built in to account for a certain amount of bad debt with those. But the advantage of those is it's decentralized. You always get a response that is kind of contextually calibrated as opposed to a top-down solution that may not be aligned with local needs. And there is a kind of a softer side to that where people feel like they're agents of their own destiny. They're not getting handouts, and I think it has demonstrated impact.
I think this overlap between development, preparedness, readiness, risk reduction, and humanitarian response, is really important. So a lot of these overlapping, perhaps, mechanisms and policies are important as well. Thank you for that. Yes, another question here.
Thank you. I briefly
So, Haley.
Sorry, I was just wondering, we touched on this before in the previous meeting, but with regards to innovation and rematerializing shelters and the humanitarian sector, do you think that the future of it is in focusing on locality and local materials, local solutions to replace TARP, for example, or should it kind of remain as it is in an emergency context where things are sent from abroad, from like an off-site procurement factory in Pakistan or in Turkey or something?
Sure. You mean like large scale procurement? So should we put a scenario out there so we can discuss this?
Yeah.
So large scale disaster hits somewhere in the let's say Sri Lanka, right? Because it's not anywhere really. It doesn't really matter, Nepal. And you need 100,000 families are displaced. You need stuff super quickly. We don't have any alternative right now to the TARP. We talked about TARP, the plastic, and whatnot. As we discussed earlier, you should know there is no alternative to the TARP. For quickly moving it, you could buy at scale 100,000. You could fly in there within the week, pretty much. NCDO has stocks of what's our stock right now?
It depends. We've got a few different spots.
Yeah, there were loads. Yeah. So, but we could bring in 20, 30, 40,000 at a time, and then the US can bring in a bunch or whatever. And it'd be nice if the innovation was creating some different thing, vegetable matter and straw, whatever. And perhaps that needs to be stimulated. But it's not there yet. It is not there yet. And the other thing is if it's a cold place, they'll need blankets and stuff to avoid morbidity and mortality. That's usually our aim and objective. That's our aim. Reduce death and avoid suffering. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would just add that, tarps never last as long as they should, and they get thrown away, and there's plastic waste, there's microplastics, there's issues with disrupting hormones, and, there's environmental issues with production and disposal, which never happens in the right way. And so now there is, just to build on your point, and I'm sorry that I'm talking from the back like this, but there is now currently a project with the two leads of the Global Shelter Cluster and looking at joint development of a specification along with the Americans on a plastic sheeting that will last 10 years, because we're finally admitting what the stats say, which is that people are never really temporarily displaced. The issue of permanence, not getting into durable solutions and the technical aspects of that, but it's a joke when something that's meant to last 2 years lasts 6, and we're doing it again and again. So now we're looking for a 10-year option that biodegrades really nicely without the
Interesting.
TARP plus. Now I have just noticed the time, so I think we're going to have to cut off the questions there. But what I would like to do is come back to the panel just for our last 5 or 10 minutes and say, Our original question was the humanitarian shelter and climate change. Is the shelter sector ready? Perhaps not, and vehemently not from some of us. I would certainly agree to that. I'm not a climate change optimist, I have to say. So perhaps the final question I'll give perhaps a minute, if we can think of a quick answer, which I know is not fair, to the question of how, I think, what is one thing that will mean the shelter sector is moving towards being more ready? So if we have a large question of how will the shelter sector be more ready, can we think of one thing that we could suggest today? And this is really difficult because, as we've heard from the audience, it's not just about a shelter. There's political contexts. There's the situation that when a disaster happens, you are in a disaster zone. So all of our nice words about localization and contextualization are often very difficult to implement. We think about the different needs and requests and desires of people who want different kinds of homes and the different kinds of vulnerabilities that we're trying to shelter. But I would just like to put you on the spot and ask for a minute of what is one thing you could do perhaps? Of course, if you have the entire answer, I'm willing to listen to that as well.
I think if I just choose one thing, it would be focusing on capability development of those delivering shelter and the institutions around those to really understand how issues of shelter would interact with issues of climate, to really help them understand the kind of impacts climate change is having in the areas where they want to deliver these services. And also how we can develop robust solutions by considering top-down scientific information on climate change, but crucially bottom-up perceptions on what people think of climate change in the areas where these kind of shelter might be needed. So, to cut the long story short, I think capability development and capacity enhancements are the way to go, not only a focus on infrastructural solutions or technological innovation.
Yeah, building on that, I think speaking to some of our energy experts through NORCAP that have been deployed to some of our country offices, the first hurdle in actually addressing any of our environmental impact or trying to raise awareness about climate change, the first hurdle is actually being the level of understanding of what climate change is and our carbon footprint with our staff, and contextualizing that to be relevant to their everyday lives. Because without building that knowledge and capacity within our own staff, we cannot start to influence any kind of change within the wider areas where we're working. So I think that that has been one of the main hurdles that's been highlighted. I think, secondly, just to sort of reiterate what I said earlier, I think the main thing we have to do is work together, and we have to work together in a multidisciplinary way. And I would really hope that we are not going to work in our separate organisations, as I said before, but that donors, people working on technological solutions and international organisations rally together to have a collective front to this, rather than separately applying for different funding opportunities in a competitive manner, and use this as another perhaps flagship for their organisation to make them more visible and to push them further into a financial success.
One thing I would say would be a bit along the lines of what our colleague was saying about local material and HR capacity. So, like human resource, whether that's a technical training level or just, encouraging and stimulating the economies to get more people involved in how to use locally available, low cost, hopefully low impact materials better. across the areas at risk, which we know where they are from the climate modeling and our observations. And it might even help with the tents in Greece, train more people to use, local to like mud bricks. The Greeks might not be too stressed if it's like a little mud shelter. You can take it down straight away, stabilize with a bit of lime. Hey, and then suddenly it's really warm as well. You don't need to change it every year. And it's got some kind of simple A-frame roof thing made from the recycled plastics that our colleagues over here are working on. Amazing, they can turn waste into that. Scale that sort of stuff up in many countries, and then you will have more capability overall to respond. And voila.
So I volunteer for a lovely organisation called Transition Town Brixton, and they're part of the Global Transition Network. And one of the things that we do with young people and with old people is we do something called visioning, where we try to create, even through a physical show or event, or through sometimes taking people through almost like a meditation activity to imagine a different future. And this isn't a solution to all the problems that we've talked about at all, but it's amazing what happens when people have an opportunity to see and imagine their built environment differently. And a lot of the things that make those places, urban places, better are also better to live in, are also can be wrapped up in making them more resilient to climate change as well. So if you can ever do one of those.
Great, fantastic. So as we mentioned at the beginning, there are drinks on offer. There's no drinks on offer. My goodness, we're going to blame the COVID logistic supply chain problem, perhaps? Okay, no drinks. You're welcome to loiter around in the foyer without drinks and talk to one another. But I would just like to end by thanking so much for your time, your expertise, Aditya, Magnus, Kate, Amelia. Thank you so much for coming, and we really appreciated this panel.
On the drinks front, in the UCL hasn't provided the drinks, but about 50% of us are the UK Shelters Forum, so we can just do it in the UK Shelters Forum way, which is right now we take a vote on which pub we're going to. So there are two options. We can go back towards Tottenham Court Road, where the Marlborough Arms will be visible, or we can go towards the Institute of Education, where we're having the drinks tomorrow, where there's a student bar with a roof terrace that will have lots of space. It's about 5 minutes if we walk to the rest, about 7 minutes if we walk to the left, but we'll be there again tomorrow.
Is the student bar cheaper?
It will be cheaper. The space they do pizza.
You tell us where to go, we'll go there.
Student bar, that sounds good. Pizza, cheap beer.
I don't think it's a good option. Okay, should we go there? I don't know. I was asking the more senior people in the room if they had better ideas, because I haven't really done a lot of drinking around here. Or eating pizza. Yeah, you do. I was a mature student. Okay, right, let's go to the Institute Bar. Institute Bar. Who knows where it is? Mary knows where it is. I know where it is. Okay, we'll lead you in groups to the Institute Bar. Thank you very much, everyone.